Aurelian was clearly into something with his revolutionary idea of modifying and readapting the Roman religion into the cult of Sol Invictus, the religion that Aurelian wanted to make official as the Roman state religion in an attempt to reunite and unify all Romans across the empire. Something that was absolutely necessary to achieve after the terrible decades of division and fragmentation that marked the crisis of the 3rd century for the Roman Empire. Sadly, Aurelian was assassinated shortly after saving the Roman Empire from its early collapse, making his idea and vision of a unifying religion never come to fruition, ending a few decades later with the rise of Christianity and its officialization by Constantine, followed by its imposition by force until it oppressed all other cults, creating more division than before, ending with the empire separating in two, and with the western part falling, without the West ever being as unified as during the Golden Age of the Roman Empire until today. But today's alternate scenario is not about Aurelian surviving longer, nor about exactly realizing his vision of a unifying religion with the cult of Sol Invictus. However, we are going to take inspiration from the reforms and ideas that Aurelian had to recreate a legitimate reason for the Romans to feel united as one and same people, and thus prevent the death of the idea that was once Rome from ever completely falling apart, and therefore asking ourselves the following question: what if the Roman Empire rejected Christianity? I previously presented an alternate scenario asking the same question, but referring to the Eastern Roman Empire of Justinian's time. Today we're going to focus on the original Roman Empire, the empire before the separation of West and East, which was just beginning to recover from the devastating crisis that was the crisis of the 3rd century. So, first of all, what was the cult of Sol Invictus that Aurelian wanted to implement as the official religion of the Roman Empire? I'm going to try to give the best possible summary of how the Sol Invictus cult worked, but I apologize in advance for any potential errors I might make by summarizing everything vulgarly. The figure of the Sol Invictus was a kind of divine amalgamation that was inspired by various concepts from other popular cults at that time in the Roman Empire and beyond. There was, of course, the easily identifiable figure of the sun, powerful, luminous, but also distant and global, making it possible for any culture to identify with that same figure throughout the world, venerating or respecting the light that the sun represented in the sky of all men. But mostly his two main inspirations were the Syrian sun god of Syria, as well as the figure of Mithras, from the mysterious cult of Mithraism that some of you may know from videos like those of the content creator The Crazy Historian, and his alternate scenario of what if Christmas didn't exist. The figure of the sun was already present in Roman religion as Sol, but Aurelian reformed and merged Eastern solar cults under a central figure, Sol Invictus, the invincible sun who protects Rome. In the context of the crisis of the 3rd century, Aurelian needed a unifying force for all the Romans. Aurelian needed to unify the empire under a single deity that amalgamated the others, the sun as a visible and eternal symbol common to all. The idea, unlike Christianity, was not to supplant and suppress other religions by imposing a single one with a single god. Sol Invictus must be seen as a symbolic and metaphorical fusion of all the gods, primarily Roman and Hellenistic, but which could also be interpreted with other cults practiced throughout the empire. A divine avatar representing the fusion of the other deities of the other cults of the empire in the form of the sun, the most identifiable object for all people regardless of their place or culture. Therefore, that religion would be like a simplified, summarized, and merged representation of the other religions and mystery cults of the empire, a redux version of all the pagan pantheons that inhabited the vast territory of the Roman Empire. It would only serve as a calling card for the Roman Empire as such, allowing all its inhabitants from different peoples and cultures to feel identified and part of the empire, as their deities were honored in this symbolic and political cult. But this also meant that people throughout the empire remained free to practice and worship their own polytheistic gods, with Sol Invictus merely being a part of all those cults that united all peoples as the official religion of the Roman state. The idea was good, and strategically intelligent to adopt due to the extreme need for the empire and its entire population to feel united as one people and culture, but clearly the concept and the way of implementing it were not fully developed to fulfill that desired purpose. But at the same time, it would be difficult and unfair to blame Aurelian for that failure, as he only reigned for 5 years before being assassinated, and he spent most of that time traveling throughout the empire to reunify the territories that had become independent, and thus restore some much-needed stability. But, as I said, today we're not going to talk about Aurelian surviving, or implementing and further developing the cult of Sol Invictus. That's for another day. However, we will take advantage of the crisis that was the crisis of the 3rd century to implement societal and religious reforms in the empire, which will serve as an alternative basis to what Aurelian attempted to do. And here's the secret title of this video. In addition to the Roman Empire rejecting Christianity, the Roman Empire also prematurely created the proto-idea or concept of what we know today as nationalism. That's right, we're going to create for the Romans a nationalist identity in addition to a unifying but polytheistic and tolerant religion in appearance. So, I could also call this video If the Roman Empire Became Nationalist or something like that. We're going to begin our alternate scenario during the early stages of the crisis of the 3rd century, when civil wars and false emperors were slowly beginning to emerge throughout the empire, creating an ever more pronounced division between the different parts of that vast territory. Some years earlier, Emperor Caracalla granted Roman citizenship to all peoples living within the borders of the empire, marking a stark contrast to the extreme difficulty that used to be in acquiring this prestigious citizenship. However, although this move by the emperor was strategically innovative and intelligent, it was carried out with poor execution and without considering the consequences for the Roman government of carrying out such an act. Instead of further uniting the peoples around the empire by granting them all Roman citizenship, on the contrary, this act reduced Roman citizenship in its prestige and legitimacy, making it a worthless status to bear. In a way, the logic of granting Roman citizenship to everyone was similar to giving too much power to the military generals of the Roman army. Why would I swear submission and loyalty to any emperor when I have the military power to dethrone him and become emperor myself? Why was it valued to obtain Roman citizenship if everyone obtained it without any merit? What would become of the meaning of being or not being Roman? How would you differentiate the civilized citizen from the barbarian? If anyone can be a Roman citizen, does that mean that a barbarian could also become a Roman citizen if he enters the borders of the empire? These are the questions that many were probably asking themselves at that time after Caracalla had granted citizenship to everyone. Even if at the time it seemed like the obvious answer to unify the entire empire as one people, in retrospect it was a dangerous decision that further disunited the empire, losing all the value of what it meant to be Roman. In this timeline, Caracalla would not implement this reform. However, he would leave the idea on the table so that his successors could once again take an interest in this problem that, if not resolved, could eventually end with the total disintegration of the Roman Empire as we know it. Eventually, someone similar, or Aurelian himself, would come to power, managing to save the Roman Empire from total collapse and restoring a welcome order to an empire on the verge of fragmentation. In this alternate reality, instead of focusing his attention on establishing a new official cult in the Roman state inspired by other mystery cults, he would instead attempt to draw inspiration from the diplomatic and propaganda skills of the great emperors of old, such as Augustus, to create a kind of new myth, a new Roman legacy, just as Augustus did in his day when he defined, together with the writer and poet Virgil, the origin of Rome and its foundation. Aurelian, in order to justify his greatness and his success in reuniting all the territories of the empire, would create a proto-nationalist myth, attempting to appeal to the hearts and emotions of all the peoples around the empire. He would claim, in the face of the difficult crisis that the empire was going through, that all the gods of all mythologies and mysterious cults, both the Roman, Greek, Egyptian, Phoenician, Celtic gods, and others, would have merged into a single being, a resplendent and undefeated sun, the Sol Invictus, which gave him the necessary strength to save Rome from its fall, because in the heart of all of them lies the duty of keeping intact the empire responsible for civilizing the world. Aurelian would then proclaim, after his mission to reunify the empire was accomplished, that the light and power of all the gods abandoned him after his duty was fulfilled, but that this light did not go anywhere, but rather it was distributed and sleeps in each of the Roman hearts around the empire, and that we are all in part heirs of the divine flame and Rome the divine symbol of our individual greatness, which collectively makes us the eternal empire that the gods always hoped we would become. And as a result, Aurelian would create the Parliament of Religious Union of the Roman Empire, where all the cults that accepted Roman laws and were tolerant of others, accepting that all religions were valid to create the union necessary for the greatness of Rome, could join that parliament, being a kind of alternative senate to manage the spiritual and nationalist situation of the Roman people. In addition to promoting Romanity, Aurelian also wanted to expand Latinity and Hellenicity throughout the empire, promoting and sponsoring the creation of public institutions accessible to the most humble in all the main cities of the empire, so that all classes, from the lowest to the highest, would have access and interest in learning Latin in the West and Greek in the East, making the following generations completely bilingual or trilingual and feeling even more identified and belonging to the empire and to the Roman identity, even if they never set foot in the city of Rome itself. Many of Aurelian's proclamations, reforms, and ideas would be seen as far-fetched or purely just an amusing curiosity, but not something most would take seriously, especially the unifying part of the Sol Invictus religion having helped him restore the empire with the divinity of all the gods from all mythologies and mystery cults. However, in this reality, Aurelian's assassination would become a great stroke of luck and opportunity for his ideas to be spread and taken seriously by a large part of the empire. Having been assassinated a few months or weeks after having decreed all his reforms and ideas, Aurelian would gain in legitimacy and plausibility in what counted as a nationalist myth, since having declared that the light that allowed him to restore Rome had now abandoned him to be redirected in all Romans so that the burning fire of divinity and Roman identity might dwell in all of them, his assassination would be seen almost as a prophetic act by the deceased emperor, turning him into a martyr and a prophet of his ideas. Thanks to that event, a large part, not all, but a large part of the empire's population across all the layers of society would adopt the emperor's nationalist and multi-religious ideas and values, further reinforcing the unifying idea of a one and same Romanity for all in a more organic and natural way than simply granting citizenship to everyone. The religious union organization that Aurelian founded would be used to ensure that all the leaders of every cult in the empire would have a voice in that religious and nationalist parliament, while at the same time all those cults would be protected by Roman law, allowing tolerance and acceptance of all cults, as long as they did not impose their will or proselytize to other cults in an attempt to supplant or destroy them. In that example, the religious leaders of Christianity would strongly reject entering that parliament, considering that their religion and their God was the one and only true God of the one and only true religion. The subsequent emperors, and especially reformers like Diocletian, would use Aurelian's reforms and the popularity of his nationalist and multi-religious ideas and values to further unify the loyalty of all peoples to the Roman Empire. And gradually, the union of the religious and nationalist parliament of the empire would collaborate with the emperor and the Roman Senate to begin the gradual integration of practitioners of cults and religions into the parliament as Roman citizens, which was largely the requirement for becoming a Roman citizen. If a local representative of your religion, part of the parliamentary union, could demonstrate, attest, and confirm your loyalty to your cult, the acceptance of the unifying cult between all the gods in the Sol Invictus alternative of this timeline, and your loyalty and total acceptance of the nationalist myth created by Aurelian, then, after much bureaucratic and administrative paperwork, you would be granted Roman citizenship, which little by little over the years would become the Roman nationality. Within just a generation of the implementation of these reforms and the nationalist propaganda of the empire, a large part of the population of different cults would have accepted the conditions of the religious and nationalist parliamentary union of the empire, obtaining the now Roman nationality. The new generation of young people growing up after Aurelian's reforms would have been fortunate enough to have learned more about Roman history and culture for free in public institutions, and to have become fluent in Latin or Greek, and for the most motivated, fluent in both official languages of the empire. This would create a new generation of humble citizens with a literacy rate unmatched at that point in history, with 80% of young people born after Aurelian's time knowing how to read and write in Latin or Greek or both, normalizing basic knowledge and simple but efficient education so that everyone would feel united under a single and same flag. In that context, and because of the enormous advantages it offered to them and their children, many Christians would accept the conditions of the religious and nationalist parliamentary union, thereby also acquiring Roman nationality, despite desperate cries from Christian leaders for them not to do so. As a result, and after these reforms were completely normalized, the early 4th century would consist mainly of dealing with rebellions by the most radical, extremist, and intellective factions of proselytizing religions and not part of the parliamentary union, especially Christianity, with its most radical members creating riots, chaos, and massacres throughout the empire, which would only further aggravate its image as a religion supposedly promulgating love and peace, while reinforcing the credibility and loyalty towards the nationalist and multi-religious myth of the empire. Eventually, the Roman government would not need to do much about Christianity, as it would be the local populations, fed up with the riots, looting, and massacres committed by the Christians who would end up defending themselves against the radical Christians, showing faith and patriotism towards the Roman Empire and the reforms of Aurelian to finish off and annihilate every last resolute Christian radicalist who could not accept living with and tolerating other cults that did not consider their God as the one and only true God. With Christianity neutralized and Roman unity and patriotism stronger than ever, the people would feel closer and more belonging to Roman history and the events and problems of the empire than ever before, encouraging many to join the Roman army or send their sons to it. And all those new recruits and the great Roman pride and patriotism would arrive in time, because the 4th century would be the beginning of a series of constant attempts at Germanic invasions, multiple wars with the Sassanid Persians, and the first conflicts with the Hunnic hordes. Because the entire Roman population would feel more invested in the empire's well-being and survival against its enemies, loyalty would drive the creation of strong and numerous soldiers, much more so than was the case at the time, while new protectionist laws and applications would be implemented due to Roman nationalism. Inspired by the impressive constructions that were the Aurelian walls and other constructions such as Hadrian's Wall, the Romans would invest throughout the 4th century a large part of their effort and resources in strengthening and protecting the Roman borders, especially in the north, no longer wanting to depend solely on the natural defenses that were the Rhine River and the Danube River, but to build gigantic walls that would cross all the northern borders of the empire, similar to the Chinese walls. With such imposing and practical fortifications, the empire would have had a much easier time protecting itself from and repelling barbarian invasions, and would not be forced to integrate Germanic barbarians into its forces and as an integral part of Roman life in general, especially with the massive support of patriotic recruitment that the Roman army would have had. The Romans could have defended Britain more efficiently from Saxon and Pictish invasions by reinforcing and enlarging Hadrian's Wall to make the province an unbreakable territory impossible for any barbarian to invade. While having their northern borders more or less protected, the Romans would have been able to more easily focus their resources on defending against the multiple attacks and conflicts provoked by the Sassanid Persians, ensuring that greater stability and tranquility would be maintained on the eastern borders. By the 5th century, what was in our timeline, unparalleled chaos, invasions from all sides, destruction and looting by barbarians, loss of huge chunks of territory, and constant and endless civil wars among the Romans themselves, in this reality, many of those problems would be greatly attenuated, with the empire's defenses being large and robust and the army more prepared and numerous than ever. Due to the nationalist and extremely patriotic identity that would have grown among all Romans in the empire, and the access to basic education that would have developed over the decades, the new generations would have had more incentive out of pride and a desire to protect the empire in the face of adversity, to procreate even more, greatly increasing the empire's birth rate. The population would reach new peaks never seen before, even surpassing the population of the Roman Empire prior to the Antonine Plague, having a population close to 150 million inhabitants by the beginning of the 5th century. This would have maintained the constant development and maintenance of infrastructure and roads throughout the empire, accelerating the urbanization process and expanding employment and innovation opportunities, especially with several generations of Romans having received a basic education that would have allowed them to be bilingual or trilingual in Latin and or Greek, and to know how to read and write those same languages. Thanks to all these circumstances and context better than in our timeline, by the time the Huns decided to launch a full invasion of Europe led by Attila the Hun, the Romans would not need to rely on mercenaries or barbarian recruits, and their army would be more powerful, organized, and loyal than ever, having the means and organization necessary to repel the Huns without too many problems. Although the Punic invasion would force many Germans to try to enter the empire's borders, the invasions would be minimal and easily controlled thanks to the gigantic walls that crossed the entire Rhine and Danube rivers. This would cause mass mortality among all the Germanic tribes due to the massacres and genocides carried out by the Huns, further depopulating those Germanic lands of their population, which under those circumstances could not develop and urbanize properly. Britain would be defended from any Anglo-Saxon invasion, and even during the 5th century, it would be likely that to enlarge its territory and lands to give to its soldiers and improve and totalize the defenses of the island, that the Romans would finally completely conquer the Picts, turning Britain into an island completely dominated by the Romans. By the time in our history of what was the fall of the Western Roman Empire, here we would find an empire still united as one, large, strong, powerful, protected by gigantic defenses with a population higher than normal, and with unparalleled nationalist pride and patriotism, with the entire population feeling and calling themselves Roman. With most of the internal and external conflicts resolved, with the defragmentation of the Huns, and with a Germanic population returned to a more nomadic and defenseless way of life to create any kind of quality or urbanized organization to represent any threat to the Romans due of their lack of population after the passage of the Huns, the Romans would rise as a power with a pride, a culture, and a martial vigor recovered as in the glory days of the Pax Romana by the beginning of the 6th century. The Sassanid Persians would be the only real threat left for the Romans to neutralize by that point, having a population and number of soldiers far superior to those of the Sassanids, and being able to win and end the multiple conflicts they would always initiate without much trouble. It is even possible that, with their northern border stable, and to finally ease the burden of the Sassanid Persians' constant attempts to invade, the Romans, after multiple successive campaigns to invade Mesopotamia and cut off the Sassanids from one of their richest and most important regions, would conquer that territory and transform the Lakhmids into their own client state, loyal to the Roman Empire. Thus, they would initiate the project of gigantic defensive walls like those on their northern borders, but this time in the eastern part of the empire, completely cutting off the Sassanids from that part of the world. What was in our timeline a very dark age and the beginning of the slow and painful death of a once great civilization, here would be the continuation and rebirth of that same civilization, strengthened and healed of the ills of its society that led to the crisis of the 3rd century, with the Pax Romana suffering in comparison to this new golden age. By that point, after centuries of societal, religious, and nationalist reforms, the empire's extremely large population lived more united and stronger than ever. In each province of the empire, the different peoples who once belonged to other populations, now completely Latinized and Hellenized, freely practiced their religions and cults with total respect for other peoples, accepting that all divinities are related to a single being, a being whose light illuminates the hearts of all of them, the light they carry within themselves to continue protecting and prospering the glorious Roman Empire. And in actuality, it's difficult to continue understanding religious practices in the way we understand them at this point. Most provinces and regions with specific cults and religions continue to practice and hold celebrations more out of cultural, artistic, and tourist interest than out of genuine extreme religious belief, mostly just in order to keep respecting their tradition. Most people believe in themselves as bearers of the divine light that makes them the beacon of civilization itself for the rest of humanity and the world, not needing any other being or divinity apart from themselves individually to solve their personal and societal problems, being the very pinnacle of logical reasoning and pragmatism. Virtually no one practices Christianity anymore, and the religion is on the verge of extinction and oblivion. Judaism is still practiced by Jews, but it's undergoing a process of transformation and adaptation to the more modern and intellectual times demanded by the empire. Fewer and fewer Jews consider their religion as literal facts, but rather metaphorical, and increasingly accept the interpretation of the unification of all the gods of different religions around the empire under the figure of Sol Invictus. Also, after several centuries of several generations of citizens educated at a basic level, and with the widespread literacy and multilingualism, a new class of intellectuals not necessarily descended from the most sophisticated and wealthy strata of society began to emerge, starting to create a counter-movement of new thinkers with new ideas and innovations, such as, for example, the invention of the printing press. Although prosperity within the Roman world was unmatched until then, outside Rome, the empire would have to confront a new challenge, a new enemy more violent, aggressive, and dangerous than all the previous ones. The Arabs, through the powerful unifying power of religious radicalism that was Islam, would become a mighty empire of bloodthirsty warriors and expansionist desires, with the Roman world being too tempting a prey to resist trying their luck in conquering its lands. But the Romans were in this timeline the most advanced, numerous, militarily prepared, and organized civilization in the world, and after centuries of constant preparation and defensive strategies through multiple wall-building projects, the Arabs simply would have no chance of directly invading Roman lands around the Mediterranean. The almost impenetrable defenses of the walls, plus the gigantic number of soldiers that Rome could mobilize thanks to having its northern borders secured, combined with new weapons and military innovations such as the invention of Greek fire, would make it impossible for the Arabs to expand as they would have wished, abruptly halting the momentum of their brutal and rapid conquest of the lands beyond their peninsula. Having no other option but to negotiate diplomatically with the Romans, no matter how much that idea disgusted those proud nomads, and the Romans knowing that a population as radicalized as theirs could not be completely eliminated so easily and in the short term, they would decide to take advantage of the situation and replace an old enemy with a new one. The provinces of Mesopotamia, very expensive and difficult to maintain, and never having been fully integrated into the Roman nationalist system, would be abandoned and ceded to the Arabs, with them taking advantage of that offer on a plate of gold from the Romans to obtain those lands, and also conquer and completely annihilate the Sassanid Persians, also creating a gigantic caliphate empire as in our timeline, which would extend much further to the east than to the west, since in this reality, the Arabs would never set foot on North African lands. With that move, the Romans would have broken the balance of power that has existed in that region of the world for almost a millennium, replacing it with a new balance of power, with another younger power which could undoubtedly in the future become the greatest rival to Rome's greatness, and perhaps eventually the only obstacle to knowing which empire will one day dominate the entire world. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel in order to have early access to new videos, and comment on what you thought of this video. And without anything else to say, see you next time.